IoT Unplugged. Tune in to the Internet of Things. Hi, this is Christian McCann, editor of IoT Insider, and welcome to our podcast, IoT Unplugged, where each episode will be examining and discussing some of the most interesting and pressing issues surrounding IoT today. IoT's expansion has been rapid, from its humble origins being used for things like telling the stock level of a soda machine, to now being the driving force of smart cities. IoT is slowly becoming everywhere, and Statista say there are over 15 billion IoT devices currently across the world. Yet, legislation surrounding security has been lax, only now recently seeming to catch up through things like the UK's PSTI bill or the EU's Cyber Resilience Act. But what do these various pieces of legislation aim to address around IoT? Why now? And what should you look out for? To discuss this, I'm joined by Jason Blake, IoT Security Certification Manager at IASME Consortium. Jason, thanks for joining us today. If you could just start by introducing yourself, the consortium, and also what it is that you do.
So it's great to join you today, Christian. I'm really pleased to be on the podcast to discuss the IoT legislation and obviously any other things that come up during this conversation. So a bit about myself. I've only worked in the IoT field since January of this year. Previous to that, I worked as an information security manager and left IT for a 5.5-year period to go and pursue my career dream of being a prison officer. Did that job for 5 and a bit years. October last year, left the prison service and moved into IT. And January took this role within IASME. Really enjoy it. See IoT as a very quickly and developing field. There is so much change and so much innovation within the field. It is just an exciting place to work. IASME are best known, I think, for being the official partner for the National Cybersecurity Centre on the delivery of the Cyber Essentials programme, which is owned by the NCSC. And as part of that, IASME have developed other schemes that IASME own to sort of try and complement the cybersecurity posture of many businesses in different ways. So, for example, there is the IASME Cyber Assurance Programme, which is an information security management system. There is the Maritime Cyber Baseline, which is for the maritime industry to improve its cybersecurity and for vessels. There is the CAA and GovAssure programs. The CAA Assure is a part. We partner with the Civil Aviation Authority on, and that's one of the other schemes we run. And then there is my IoT program, and the IoT security scheme is, rather than like with Cyber Essentials, for example, that certifies a whole business, or Maritime, which certifies a specific ship, the IoT scheme specifically certifies individual devices against the legislation and ensures that devices that have the certification are compliant with the UK legislation. And also, we are partnered with Secured by Design, the Police Crime Prevention Initiative, to provide a prerequisite for their certification and their accreditation that our certification, our IoT cyber assurance, is a prerequisite of achieving the Secured by Design accreditation now. And the IoT program, we're seeing a lot more traction within the IoT world because of incoming legislation, like you mentioned, Christian. There is a lot of IoT legislation popping up around the world, and ours is a statement of compliance with the UK legislation. So if a business wants to ensure that they're compliant with this UK legislation, that's where our certification comes in, and they can achieve that and use that as to say, actually, we are compliant with this legislation.
Okay, well, that's a good point for us to jump off. You talk about the UK legislation, and the UK legislation is like the PSTI bill. And I was wondering, what can you tell me about this?
So the PSTI bill originally was two pieces of legislation that were sort of super glued together, which is almost in the name, the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure. They were two very separate things. The first bit is the only bit that applies to IoT. It's the product security. The product security relevant legislation was brought in by the government because they feel that there are a lot of IoT devices and smart connected products for sale within the UK market, and there was no regulation onto how these devices were configured. No sort of guidance as to how consumers were viewed by these manufacturers. And also, as one of the technical controls is around support periods. And I think that's a really key one, because the government have said, actually, you need to be to the manufacturers, you need to be very clear and upfront about how long these devices will be supported for. Because it's all well and good going to Amazon, for example, and buying a smart toaster to find out that actually the smart function might only be supported with a software update for 6 months, and then it's useless, or it's a security risk on your network, which in a home presents a smaller risk. But if it's in a business network, then the risks are there. So I think the government have stepped in to sort of give a guide as to what these devices should look like and how they should be configured.
I can really sympathise with that. I brought a smart coffee machine and it's no longer supported. So if only I would have brought it after the introduction of this, it'd still be working.
Exactly. And
so with that being said, sorry.
No, go on, Christian. That's fine.
I was just going to say, so, I obviously see the rationale behind this. Was there like a tipping point for this introduction of the bill? Was it like the proliferation of smart devices? They started to feel like, this is getting so big, it now is calling for it?
I think that's exactly right, Christian. I think that the rationale was within government that actually, when you look at the numbers of IoT devices, that currently it works out that if in a smart home, if in a home you have around 10.9 smart devices, that number jumps to around 15.5 devices if you've got children, because children always want the latest technologies and the latest things. When I was younger, a Sega Mega Drive was the latest piece of technology. Now it's they want a smart speaker in their bedroom, or a smartphone, for example. So I think that the number of smart devices has grown rapidly, and the estimated number is that by 2030 there'll be around 75 billion connected devices around the world. And I think that's where the government have thought, with this many devices, there needs to be some level of control and level of guidance for manufacturers to be brought in. So that, for me, was the rationale, and I think you were spot on with that.
Okay, well, interesting. Obviously, it's not just UK legislation. The EU Cyber Resilience Act. We're seeing the US Cyber Trust Mark. You're saying the proliferation of devices is maybe, it's a big reason why we're starting to see legislation around the world coalesce. But is there maybe another thing? Was there a lot of IoT devices that lacked good security? Is that another thing that prompted this?
Again, excellent point, Christian. One of the sort of longest standing jokes within the IoT field is that the S in IoT stands for security. Obviously, it's not there, and because a lot of people's sort of opinion with IoT and smart devices was that there was very little security there. And like you say, there's the PSTI bill in the UK, which is a world-leading piece of legislation. We're one of the first countries to actually implement that into law. There is then the Cyber Resilience Act in the European Union. There'll be the US Cyber Trust Mark in the US. Other countries such as Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Brazil are all looking at their own pieces of legislation to look at how they can protect their consumers by looking at what legislation they can bring in with IoT devices. I think that, again, the sheer volume of devices around the world, and we all are guilty of wanting easier lives, and smart devices give you that. For example, 30 years ago, who would have thought that from your phone, from a mobile telephone, you could, whilst out in the shop, pay for your shopping, look at the CCTV at home to see who's knocked on the door, and then have a conversation with that person via a doorbell. These pieces of technology are advancing so quickly that in the next 30 years, who knows where we'll be. But what I can say, how I feel, is that IoT will play a key role in that, because we all want our lives to be more convenient and easier, and I think IoT enables that.
Oh, indeed. But looking at these legislations, obviously, for instance, the US Cyber Trust Mark is a voluntary scheme, and so I was just wondering, what are like maybe some similarities in what these legislations are trying to do, and maybe what are the differences?
So for me, I think all of the governments are in the right area. They're trying to do the right thing to try to protect consumer data. They're trying to protect against devices, perhaps being rogue devices or being hacked and causing issues for people and the purchases of these devices. Like you said, the US Cyber Trust Mark is voluntary, and like within the UK, the PSTI bill, yes, it will be law, and the enforcement date is the 29th of April 2024. The government have given that 12-month grace period to be compliant with legislation, but there is no, like, for example, the US are looking whether to mandate a specific mark on products, whereas there is nothing like that within the UK. That's one of the reasons that our certification exists, because it is an option for businesses to say, rather than hire a head of compliance who needs to make sure to be aware of the changes within these standards or changes within the legislation. This certification could be much easier and much more cost effective to ensure that actually the products that we are selling are in line with UK law, because we are constantly in conversation with ITSE, who their standard is the sort of one of the most well respected within the world of IoT. It's called the ITSE EN 303645. It makes 13 recommendations for IoT devices, and the top 3 recommendations are what was taken by the government and wrapped up in the PSTI bill. But I think what all of the legislations are trying to achieve is they're trying to achieve a safer world for consumers and a safer world for when we buy a smart connected product, we can be confident that the data that's transmitting and that it's sending to us, or that we're using that device to submit data, that data, one, is secure, two, we know where it goes and where it's kept, but also that the devices are of a quality that they will continue to be supported, that consumers can buy in confidence knowing that, like you said, Christian, your smart coffee maker after 6 months, 12 months isn't going to be unsupported, and therefore a potential problem for people.
Okay, well, excellent. Well, you talked about, like we said, about the smart coffee machine. I'm glad I brought that up. I'm glad I had a real world example. Maybe I was wondering if you could give some examples of, like, for instance, bad practice, good practice, and best practice by companies affected by the PSTI legislation.
So one of the things I do in my role regularly is speak to companies and sort of speak to them about the legislation and make sure people are aware of it. Even people within the IoT field are still yet to be aware of the PSTI legislation, or within the manufacturing industry, for example, the awareness is quite limited. I was at an IoT event only 2 weeks ago. I had a speaking slot there, and I was talking to them about the technical controls within the PSTI bill. And actually, I asked the 75 people in the room who had heard of PSTI, and there were only 5 hands that went up. So it wasn't. It's not a widely known piece of legislation yet, but it will need to be, because there are enforcement measures. There will be an enforcement division set up to ensure enforcement of this legislation. And that's what one of the things we see moving forward, and we're looking at when I talk to clients, that we do have examples of bad practice. I spoke to a company last month that produces a CCTV system. They set up the client whenever they deploy that to a site for a business. They set up the client to be able to log in remotely to view that CCTV, and the password, the username and password is the business name for where it's been deployed, and the password will be 123456. Now, I don't know about anybody that's listening, but in 2023, it is, for me at least, it's not a revolutionary idea that we don't use default passwords or easily brute forceable passwords such as 123456 default password admin. These sort of words and these sort of numbers are not the sort of things we should be using as password. We should be using ways to generate secure passwords, and also passwords that can't be easily replicated or that are random, that aren't, that couldn't be brute forced by an attack, for example. Some of the good practice we see, absolutely, there's so many companies out there that do have good practices, that do have ways of looking at things and saying, right, actually, this is what we need to do, and this is the technical controls that are there, and this is how we meet them. If they come to us and say, right, we're not sure how we meet these, but obviously we want to show compliance with legislation, we work with several different certification bodies and consultants and assessors that can make recommendations to people on good practice and then best practice to businesses. And one of the things we have seen is within a company, within the certification, we insist to meet the legislation that you must have a vulnerability disclosure policy. A business came to us wanting the certification and said, actually, we don't have a vulnerability disclosure policy. We don't actually know what would need to be in that. So we worked with one of our consultants and put together a free template of a vulnerability disclosure policy, which we make available on our website to download for free, because it's not just about making sure that a business passes the certification. It's about ensuring that actually the security posture of businesses within the industry improves, so that actually consumers as a whole benefit, to make sure that the industry moves to a more secure footing. And some businesses, the good practice and best practice is out there. There are some of our businesses that have done our certification that have changed the entire security posture of their business based on the recommendations of some of our consultants, and some of the assessors that we work with, because they recognise the value in having a more secure product and a more secure business.
Okay, well, going back to the PSTI, you mentioned that there was a number of points that they recommended. These were really good for any legislation. You mentioned the PSTI took the top 3 of them, so you were happy with that. But I was wondering, is there anything that maybe isn't in the legislation that you think would demand greater examining?
So the ETSI standard, which is what the PSTI has taken the recommendations from, the ETSI standard has 13 recommendations. The top 3, which are the technical controls within the PSTI legislation, are around access control, around vulnerability management, and around software support. The one for me, there is another point that I think could have been integrated quite easily into the PSTI legislation, which is around resilience of these devices. So I think that the other point around resilience should have been that, for example, if there is a power outage, some devices need to maintain a certain level of function during that power outage or network outage. A smart lock, for example, it's great that it's a smart lock, but actually, when there's a power and network outage, that smart lock needs to still function as a lock, and it still needs to make sure that people are not locked in or out of their properties. So that, for me, is something that I think that the government could have looked at as an extra step to say, well, if your device falls into X category, this is another part that we need to comply with. And I also think that moving forward, that the rest of those technical controls are there for the government's disposal, that should they want to increase the security of these IoT devices, they would naturally look at the other 10 standards, the other 10 points within the standard, to say, what are the next couple of points that we could introduce into the PSTI legislation to actually ensure further compliance and to ensure further security, and look at greater legislative drivers for that.
Okay, well, looking at the difference in legislation, just going back to the US Cyber Trust mark, that's like a voluntary labeling scheme. But I was wondering, what is your opinion on a scheme for IoT devices, for instance, to be voluntary? So where the onus is on consumers to make the decision versus manufacturers to ensure that the devices are up to a certain standard.
So for me, I think that the government does mandate in certain ways certain sort of certifications or certain things that put an onus on the manufacturer. And I think that the US Cyber Trust mark, it is a voluntary scheme, and it is there so that I think consumers need to be made aware that actually this is a sign of quality. This is if a device has this mark on it that actually it is of a technical standard that it means that it's more secure. For me, the issue is when you make something like that voluntary, and then there'll be cost involved to manufacturers to get to that standard or to ensure that those products are secure. I think that that's where things fall down because most businesses are run on cost. And if there is an extra cost, if there's an extra burden placed on the manufacturer that they look at as voluntary to get those devices to be more secure, actually, what's the incentive there for them to go ahead and to actually progress with that? Whereas I think if it was mandated that the legislation and the law is the law, then it does like say with PSTI, that does create a manufacturing industry that goes, right, okay, we do need to pay attention to this because there is an enforcement division set up solely to survey this to make sure that people are compliant. And that for me is the difference of if you're going to do it voluntary, that's fine, but obviously I would expect compliance will be a lot less with a voluntary scheme than something like PSCI that's mandated under this law.
Indeed, and perhaps the average consumer's knowledge of IoT and sort of the security devices might make them less than informed to be able to understand the intricacies of why maybe some of these things are important. There was a recent study that showed that a lot of people couldn't really name smart devices.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? With smart devices, people. I mean IoT. I always make this joke, but IoT sounds suspiciously like it was made up on the spot by somebody. Oh, it was the Internet of Things. But most people don't recognise it as IoT. Most people recognise it as a smart device, or and it's like people say, Alexa, for example, is not secure because of the data that it transmits and it's always recording, etc. Well, okay, but how many have Amazon sold? And that's the thing, is that the consumers, I think, they see a device that they think actually that's good, that's what I want, and the security concerns and the security of that device are lower down on the priority list. Things like how much does it cost? That's one of the things that people always want. People always want to know how much does it cost, what can it do, and I think when you look at, if you filter Amazon, for example, as a website by product, you can search by price, high to low, you can search by recommendations. There's nothing there that says you can search by security and to make sure that the devices you're actually purchasing are secure. And that's why I think the legislation is so key to make sure that consumers are protected, because most people aren't aware, don't think about it, and actually would only think about it in a situation where there was a problem. And I think that is something that as we rely more and more on smart devices, that will become a bigger and bigger problem.
Indeed. Well, finally, maybe I'd just like to talk about your certification and its benefits with the legislation. How is it going to improve the security of these devices? You talked about default number passwords being a thing, but is there anything else that is really key you would like to mention?
Yeah, so our certification is 2 stages. It is a level 1, which is a verified assessment. You have access to an online portal. You put the information into that about your device, about to answer the points around the legislation, such as the default passwords, around vulnerability disclosure policies, and around support periods. That's then reviewed by an independent assessor, of which we work with several. We work with several certification bodies and several assessors. So that was reviewed by an assessor, and then should that not comply with the standard that is required to meet certification, that assessor can give expert advice and feedback to a business as to how to improve the security of that device, what they need to do further before they can achieve certification. And then what we see is that the business goes away, they look at the advice and feedback they've been given, they make some changes to their devices, or they make some changes to the policy that's involved, or, for example, where that vulnerability disclosure policy is displayed. Is it displayed in a nice, easy place to find on the company website, or is it tucked away somewhere that actually it's not publicised? So actually, part of the PSTI legislation is that that vulnerability disclosure policy needs to be public. publicly accessible. So then at the end of the level 1 process, if they've achieved the correct standard, we issue a certification, and that's a pass. And then if they want, they can move on to the level 2, which is a hands-on audit of that device and that product. Does it do everything that it says that it can do? So that it's set up as the assessor would act as a normal consumer to make sure that actually that device does everything that the manufacturer is claiming, and also then look at the device and the policies around it. So, for example, what is the policy around making sure there's no default passwords? How is that password generated, for example? One of the other ones is around how that device collects data. How is that data stored, and how is that data transmitted to people? Is that secure? And then again, looking at the policies maybe around the support periods and how a business is going to support that device for X amount of time, and defining that period of time, so that again consumers can make an informed decision. Our certification is aimed at small and medium enterprise, but obviously we will certify any IoT device or platform. It is what we like to think it's an affordable certification. It's £500 for the level 1 and £2,000 for the level 2, so it's £2,500 in total to do both levels. And what we find with that is actually it does generally improve the security of the device, because the assessors are trained and experts at looking at how these devices work and then how they could actually improve the security. So we often find that there's recommendations made by assessors to businesses as to how they can improve. For example, on the vulnerability disclosure policy, again, some businesses, their policy isn't great, but that's just not just the same on vulnerability disclosure. You find that across the board with lots of different policies. So the assessor can make recommendations to that vulnerability disclosure policy and say, actually, how about this? Or have you thought about this? And it's that sort of, it's bringing that expertise to businesses. One of the things we regularly talk about is the fact 99% of UK businesses are small or medium in size, and there needs to be an accessible scheme for people who are wanting to sell these devices, who need to comply with this legislation but actually don't know where to start. And that's where our certification was born out of, to give that help to businesses and to help to entrepreneurs and manufacturers to say, you don't need an expensive policy pack put together that you constantly have to update, and you constantly have to keep looking at the standards and the legislation to make sure you're constantly up to date. It's actually more cost effective to have a certification that you renew once a year to say, actually, we are compliant with this legislation.
Yeah, so if that's good on your end, I think that was a really fascinating podcast. So I just want to say I think it's a good place to end it, Jason. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us.
No, not a problem. Always happy to speak to yourself, an IoT Insider. Obviously, I have written some articles for you previously, and always happy to contribute moving forward. The only other thing I'd like to bring to the attention of anyone listening is IASME are actually running a webinar with a panel of experts from the IoT field in October, on October the 3rd. It's an IoT legislation webinar. It's a guide for businesses, how we can help businesses and manufacturers of IoT devices, what help is out there. The speakers, we're going to look at the legal landscape around IoT, a bit like we have here, Christian. We also want to help manufacturers ensure compliance with the legislation. So we're going to cover as much of it as we possibly can. It's being hosted by Sakama Limited, who are a cybersecurity company, who are one of our certification bodies. So a big thank you to them for hosting us on the 3rd of October. But that panel discussion will involve myself as the host, and then some key names within the IoT industry, such as John Moore, founder of the IoT Security Foundation, David Rogers, MBE, the CEO at Copperhorse, who helped the government with the legislation in PSTI with drafting it, Jonathan Angwin, who is the head of the IoT legislation at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, Michelle Crudolfer from the Secured by Design, Secured Connected Device Accreditation, and Jennifer Williams, who is the technical director she's the director of IT and operations at Sakama. She is also one of our IoT assessors, and I think the 5 people on the panel will be able to give a real insight and overview of IoT legislation and how manufacturers and businesses can be compliant by the time this enforcement date of April next year. Because the biggest part of PSTI is it's not just the onus is not just on the manufacturer, it's on the manufacturer, the distributor, and the importer of those devices. Because if you're selling that device, then it is on you as well to protect the consumer. So that webinar will be the 3rd of October. And for a link, please head over to the IASME IoT page on LinkedIn, the IASME page on LinkedIn. I'm sure if you spoke to IoT Insider, Christian, feel free to give my email address to anybody who wants to speak to me about it, and more than happy to send a link out to ensure that people actually are aware of the changes in this legislation.
Well, thanks a lot, Jason. We'll surely be attending it as well, so we really look forward to it. IoT Unplugged. Tune in to the Internet of Things.